about poetry and celebrate Black history and poetry. So I'm going to start by introducing our two very esteemed guests that I'm incredibly excited are able to join us today. And then we are going to hear them read some of their work. They're going to talk about some of their work. And then we'll have a bit of a conversation. And I say conversation because I don't necessarily want it to be just, I'm going to ask questions and Abdul and Adrian will answer them, but I want it to be a conversation. If anyone else has a question or a comment or something, I want it to be an open dialogue for everyone. I think that'll be a much more interesting time. So I'm going to go ahead and start by introducing my good friend, Abdul Ali. We went to graduate school together at Washington or AU in Washington, D.C. What? I haven't had enough coffee today. He is the author of the 2015 book Trouble Sleeping, which won the 2014 New Issues Poetry Book Prize. His work has appeared on NPR, Washington Post Magazine, Poets Lore, in the anthology Full Moon on K Street, Poems About Washington, D.C., and many, many more publications. It's a very long list, but I don't want him to turn red on me. As I mentioned, he has his MFA in creative writing from American University, where we were classmates. He is currently the program coordinator at the Community College of Baltimore County for a major grant from the Andrew Mellon Foundation. He's also taught at Johns Hopkins University, Howard University, Goucher College, and I count myself incredibly lucky to know this human being and to be his friend and colleague. He's an incredible poet and will really, I think he'll wow you all. I was rereading and revisiting some of his poems just earlier today and just found myself going, oh, so good after so many of these poems. They're so powerful. Our other guest, Adrian Matejka, is a Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award finalist and the former poet laureate of Indiana. We have quite a few Indiana folks on the call, so I know they're all feeling some state pride right now. He is the author of many incredible books. My absolute favorite is actually the one he's going to be reading from today, The Big Smoke. It's a book of persona poems about prizefighter Jack Johnson and Map to the Stars. And because this man does not know how to stop, he also has a mixed media collection, Standing on the Verge / Maggot Brain, being released this month, I believe is still correct. A new collection of poems titled Somebody Else Sold the World that is being published in July. And his first graphic novel, Land on His Feet, is coming in 2022. Adrian currently teaches at Indiana University in Bloomington, and I'm very fortunate that I am one of Adrian's former students. He is a big part of who I am today, as far as a writer and quite honestly as an educator. So I am incredibly proud to have these two very important people here today. And I am going to hand it over to Abdul to start us off and start reading from his collection, Trouble Sleeping, and possibly new work, ? Maybe. I don't know what he's got for us. So Abdul, take it away. You're on mute.
Yeah, I apologize, Abdul. I have everyone is muted by default. So if anyone's going to talk, unmute yourself.
It's all right. It's kind of like, this is the new your fly is open, right? You're on mute. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Casey, you know, grad school is a blur, but it's so good to, you're one of the few people that I think about, and it's great that we're still in contact and that you're doing great work in the community. So thank you for this invitation. So just hearing your introduction, I thought of the word lineage, you know, and how we all have these literary lineages, you know, our teachers, people that we read. And I thought I would sort of, in that vein, begin with a poem about my grandfather. And I also want to keep in mind that this is a conversation. So this is not the stuffy kind of poetry reading that you go to back when we were all together, you know, it's definitely different, but definitely feel free to interrupt me, you know, after the poems so we can kind of get the conversations going. So this is called Dreaming in Plaid. When I dial your number, I wait for the recording to beep. Hey Pops, where you been? Then it hits me. Every black man is you, sitting on porches in plaid long sleeves. Where you been? No answer. Noise of silence, blue fog, the whiff of coconut milk, cream of wheat, your cheeks fever orange, calypso, eyes tear flooded, cataracted, and your cologne, a cocktail of jupe, mothballs, crushed cloves. So I like to ask my students this question, like, who are your literary ancestors, right? Because we've all been influenced by someone. And it doesn't even have to be a writer. It could be storytellers in your family, right? Maybe you have that aunt who likes to drink a little bit too much and she has the funniest stories, right? And so you associate her with being the family storyteller. Or, there's that uncle, who is a veteran, and he has all these stories, and he's experiencing PTSD, that we now call it. We didn't always have a name for these things. All right. So I'm going to read one more, and then I'm going to pass things off to my colleague. So this poem is called South Ozone Park, which is the name of the neighborhood that I grew up in Queens, New York. And it has an epigraph from Lucille Clifton, who I consider to be a literary ancestor, someone who not only attended the same school that I did maybe 50 years beforehand, but is also from New York. She's from New York State, she's from Rochester. So the epigraph reads, in the inner city, or like we call it, home. 1. They walk in packs, sweet talking, baby ooh and ah, can I get your phone number? Don't be that way, pretty thing. And when they give a smile, gold plates flash, ricocheting, ring to chain, gold fronts, toothy smiles, beaming from chest to chest. A pinball game until the night lights up like Times Square, and the hood ain't so scary until patrol cars change the colors of the sky from black and gold to red and blue. 2. Subway cars roar overhead. Boulders hold this urban pride rock in the air. Block letters spray painted on bricks. It's summer, summertime. Fire hydrants will empty on women with wine bottle shapes wearing neon spaghetti straps. The night hums with cicadas and bats and streetwalkers. It is true that on every corner lives a superhero unafraid of bullets. 3. Storefront churches on every corner, Church's Chicken, The Way of the Cross, Holy Redeemer, Soul Rescue Workers, soul food dinners after service. We walk uptown like we own it. Boomboxes, our Warcraft, it's tricky, our theme song. Islam Brothers selling Final Call newspapers, bean pies, 2 for $5. 4. When was the last time you've been home? Anything familiar? Was the soul food joint still standing on Rockaway? And what about Baisley Park, where school children walked across the frozen lake, falling inside a mirror, becoming black icicles? Was your old house still standing? Who yanked out the pear tree? Did anyone remember the block before they built a house in the lot, before English reversed into a dozen curry-stained tongues? Did anyone remember your name? Thank you.
Thank you. That was, I'm always amazed by your words on the page, but hearing you read them, it's such a different experience. It's always such a different experience hearing it come from the poet's mouth, hearing the way your voice sounds, because in my head your voice sounds totally different. And so one of the things I like to point out, since we are in this reading celebrating Black History Month, is that in this moment we're celebrating your history, and you're writing your experience, this lived experience, in the celebration of your story, but also a familiar story. There are so many things in your poems, particularly Dreaming in Plaid, where you're naming off these sights, these sounds, these smells that are familiar to me as well. And so I feel like I'm living your history with you, and that's one of the things that I think are
Beautiful.
just so powerful, so powerful. All right, Adrian, if you would like to take it away.
That's really wonderful. So now are we just going to go back and forth? Is that what we're doing? Okay, so maybe I won't show this video then, because that would be pretty weird. So I had this thing I wanted to share with you all. So I'm going to show you just a tiny bit of it. But out of respect for the fun we're having, I don't want to jam things up too much. So let me just show you really quickly a little bit. You know, everybody's a beast on the screen share after teaching for a year in this environment. But I want to just show you really quickly. That's Jack Johnson. That's who I'm going to be reading poems in the voice of. Everything that I'm going to be sharing with you in these interludes is going to be, it all happened. Everything's true. It's all historically accurate. It took me 8 years to write the book in order to be able to do that. So I wanted you to see a little bit of what this man looks like, though. He's brilliant and beautiful, and also very, very problematic in some other ways. But at the time that he was fighting, anybody over 170 pounds was a heavyweight. So here's Jack Johnson. He's 6'2" and 230. And the people he's fighting against could range from 170 pounds all the way up to the same size as he was. He was better than they were. He was faster than they were. He was a smarter fighter, but because he was Black, they would not allow him to compete in the ways that other fighters could compete. All right. So let me go ahead and read a couple of poems. You know, everything's going to be in his voice, so that way I won't have to stop and reset and re-explain. This poem's called Battle Royale. Back then, they'd chain a bear in the middle of the bear garden and let the dogs loose. Iron chains around a bear's neck don't slow him too much. A bear will always make short work of a dog. Shakespeare said Sackerson did it more than 20 times to dogs and wildcats alike. And since most creatures were naturally afraid of bears, there wouldn't always be much of a show in the bear garden. So the handlers sometimes put the bear's eyes out or took his teeth to make the fight more sportive. I believe you need eyes more than you need teeth in a fight, but losing either makes a bear a little less mean. Once baiting was against the law, some smart somebody figured colors would fight just as hard if hungry enough. So they rounded up the skinniest of us, had us stripped to trousers, then blindfolded us before the fight. They turned just a few times on the ring steps like a motor car engine before pushing us between the ropes. When the bell rang, it seemed like I got hit from 8 directions. I didn't know where those punches came from, but I swung so hard, my shoulder hadn't been right since, because the man said only the last darky on his feet gets a meal. See, I preface this by saying everything in this is true. Jack Johnson got his start fighting in these battle royales. A lot of literary people know about battle royales from the great chapter in Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. And it seemed so horrific to me when I read that at the time. But the fact of the matter is, this is one of the things people did. So they would blindfold these kids and put them in a ring and just have them fight it out until somebody was left. I mean, we were just talking about this person who lives down the street from me, who's got a Confederate flag outside of his house. And right now his car is stuck in the snow outside of my house. So if you hear like sort of a hillbilly engine revving, that's this guy making all kinds of noise trying to get out of the snow. Anyway, I don't think I mentioned this, but it's important that Jack Johnson's parents were slaves. So they were he's the first generation after emancipation, and he's doing all of this work during Jim Crow. Prize fighter. I love horses because they'll outrun the fastest man. They are majestic, as stately as a Saturday woman before a party. Horses smell like what it means to be fast, sweat and gravel kicked up on early morning runs, the in and out of breath like gravel in tired lungs. I groomed and raced horses from Texas to Philadelphia till one broke my leg bone with a back kick. Thanks to that break, I can't ride anymore. And even if I could, we got these automobiles now and they can carry us a mile a minute. I'm buying the fastest one of these things I can find once I get my money together. I'm like an automobile in the ring. My fists work like cranked up engines. I've got the kind of elasticity other fighters dream about when I put them to sleep on the canvas. When I clinch a man, it's like being swaddled in forgiveness. When I hook a man, it's like being hit by frustration. I can't tell if these horses are happy or confounded by this new means of locomotion, but I can say with certainty, my prize fighting cohorts are decidedly dissatisfied by my presence. That's a direct quote, decidedly dissatisfied by my presence. I took that right from something he said. And at the same time, the people of his era imagined that he wasn't even a human being. So it's a pretty complicated thing. Thanks.
Thank you. Wow, it's always so fascinating to me, hearing you read from these poems that I've heard you read from so many times, and how I'm always just struck by how much you embody Jack Johnson. And I know this is a question you've been asked a million times, but in front of this new audience, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to why you chose to tell Jack Johnson's story. I mentioned that for Abdul, we're hearing his history, we're living his history, but here we're living Jack Johnson's history through your voice, which is a very magical thing that you do very well. But why Jack Johnson? Why tell this story?
Yeah, thanks for saying that, Casey. I should have started out by telling everybody, I mean, you especially, but everyone, how proud I am of the work that you do. You're a marvel in the world and on the page. I'm really glad that we got to work together. Jack Johnson is fascinating to me for a lot of reasons. In part, and we were talking about this before we got started, he's part of a kind of history that doesn't get talked about necessarily, a part of Black history that is incredible, but also complicated for everybody to try to attend to. My mom was a big fight fan, and we used to watch the great heavyweights of the 70s, like Muhammad Ali and George Foreman and these guys, back when boxing was on TV and it was sort of part of the larger cultural conversation in a way that it's not really now, right? Pay-per-view and all that kind of stuff. And whenever we would watch these fights, my mom would be, the person my mother was cheering for would be losing. She would say, F that guy, he's no Jack Johnson. And I had no idea who this guy Jack Johnson was or why she was always bringing him up until, probably 30 years later. And I saw a picture of Jack Johnson, remembered my mother saying that, and I thought, man, I need to write something about this. And the more time I spent with his story, the more I realized that it really hadn't been told the way that it needed to be told. And I hope that if I did anything in this book, I hope what I did was sort of represent him in a way that was accurate and shows respect to the work he did. Like we're talking about Abdul doing this beautiful work, thinking about his family and these experiences and trying to honor that space. It's the same thing, only a little bit different because it's not mine. The intersection is that, he was a Black man, I'm a Black man. He liked clothes, I like clothes. And that's kind of the end of it. That's like the end of the intimacy between Jack Johnson and me. So trying to excavate that history and show it the respect it deserves, I think was the central mission of this book.
And one thing that I love, and I really encourage everyone on the call, if you have access to SMC's library, we have copies of The Big Smoke. And if you have not read many of the poems from this book, I recommend it because it's not just Jack Johnson's story. One of my I have to say, hands down, my favorite poems in here are the letters to Belle, the space that we get for not just Jack Johnson, who is a name that we can all quickly Google, learn quite a bit about and hear his history, but we have a space for these women that were in his life, for Belle, for Hattie, and the haunting voice of Etta. And we have a space for these Black women that are not, we don't hear this in history either. And we get to see Jack Johnson as a hero, and then we also get to see the really problematic parts of what it is to be a hero, and that he isn't, it's not always the shiny, happy version of history. We celebrate him not just for his amazing fight record or for the interesting person he was, but we also dig deep and recognize that he was also a troubled dude, and had a history that was not shiny, a lot of the time. It's very complicated. And so and it's so amazing to me how reading the two of you, reading your work, it's so different. And yet so much of it speaks the same to me of this experience. And so I'm hoping that you can talk to us a little bit about how you found your voice in poetry, through other Black poets. I've luckily been very well submerged into Black poetry, and it's something that I feel like I'm very much an audience member of. I can't claim it as my own. That's not my community, but it's something I can cherish. But my voice isn't quite the same, and I'm not going to gather that voice. So who gave you your voice? Who gave you this space? And who really inspired you to tell your stories?
You want to go ahead, Abdul? I was talking for a long time.
Oh gosh, that's funny because I was writing a question I want to ask you, but I'm gonna first respond to what Casey asked. You know, I think that I don't know. I went to a very unusual. Maybe it wasn't so unusual, but when I tell my story, people are like really agape. But I went to an all-Black elementary school in New York City. And what was so interesting about this school is that the teachers were not just great teachers, but they were almost like jazz musicians. Like they improvised lessons. I remember I had a science teacher who created a rap so we could learn mitosis. I mean, it was, I don't know, I just feel like going to a school like that, you didn't need permission to learn about your history. And also, I remember we had like a weekly assembly. It was like a big deal, right? We would sing the Negro anthem and the Star Spangled Banner afterwards. And they brought a poet in, like they brought a poet in. And I was just so fascinated with this idea of being a poet. And, she had a book, and she had the kente cloth, and, she was really tall and beautiful. And I was like, oh my gosh, I want to be a poet, But, just being raised by my grandparents, I think that, having that gap, that significant gap in life experience, I think was very interesting. Like we talked politics over dinner, like it was part of dinner, to sort of watch the news along with Jeopardy that was going on. And so there wasn't very much a separation between talking about your day and historic events. Like they all kind of washed, right? Like a lot of my Jewish friends, they will say, let us not forget, right? And so in a similar way, I would learn about things that happened before I was born, and I know that some people say that history repeats itself, but a poet friend of mine says that history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. So, I'll just say that I think that that kind of beginning was very important for me. And I'm so excited that I was born when I was, because I'm not, like too far removed. I was born in '84, so obviously we didn't have the devices that we have today, but I had the memory of going to the library and using the card catalog and seeing the first bubble Apple computer, and then of course things changing a lot later, So I'm grateful for all of that. That was a great backdrop, to becoming a poet, becoming a writer with a historic sensibility. Yeah.
I love all of that. I love the connections between poetry and history to begin with, right? I mean, it's a cultural thing, but also I think it is a thing that used to be part of poetry as a whole. Like I remember playing Scrabble with a friend of mine, and I dropped the word griot on and to win the game, and he challenged me, and we went to the dictionary, and it wasn't in the dictionary. I was like, how in the world is this not in the dictionary? You've got bling in the dictionary, but you don't have this. I mean, I might be mispronouncing it because I've never seen it phonetically spelled. I mean, like nobody's ever phonetically said it to me. So anyway, this long history of connecting poetry and connecting song and connecting history as a means of memory and rememory, right? I think it's pretty integral to the community, and so I love that those divides were never actually divides for you, right? Like that you were able to see all of it as part of the same continuum, which is really what it is. Um, I didn't read any poetry. I guess I read Where the Sidewalk Ends or something like that, but I didn't read any poetry at all until I was in college. And so when I was in high school, I guess I read Shakespeare's sonnets, and I'm borrowing this from Gil Scott Heron, but I remember looking at this sonnet and thinking, I recognize these words, just not in the order in which they appear. You know what I mean? It made absolutely no sense to me at all. But then somebody showed me Lucille Clifton, who you mentioned earlier, and Gwendolyn Brooks, and Yusef Komunyakaa, and these Black poets, of course, Langston Hughes, like The Negro Speaks of Rivers. That poem meant so much to me when I finally found it. And so there's this whole tradition of things that I wasn't familiar with or aware of until much later, because I sort of had the opposite experience as Abdul did. I went to an almost completely white high school in the suburbs of Indianapolis. When I first moved out there were only 6 Black students at the school. And by the time I left, it was a little bit more robust culturally. But those first couple of years, when it was just me out in the desert, it was, I wouldn't wish that on anybody, even though it continues to happen for so many people, whether it's about race or gender or also economics, right? The other part about that school was that it was an incredibly wealthy high school, and we weren't at all. So all of a sudden, I'm not only one of the only people of color, only Black students, and then also I'm one of the only poor students too. So all of that kind of business is it's going to impose itself on the work that we're trying to do. It also presents itself in the art later. So yeah, I decided I wanted to be a poet after I saw Yusef Komunyakaa read, though. That's a much shorter version of this. I saw him read when I was in college in a coffee shop, and he actually burnt the place down. Like the fire alarms were going off, people were losing their stuff. And I thought, whatever he just did, and I think this is another intersection with Abdul and I was like, whatever he just did, I want to do that. Like, I want to do what he just did. I've never seen anybody moved by words like that before.
Absolutely. I actually had a very similar experience the first time I read Skinhead by Patricia Smith. That's when I wanted to become a poet. And this is one of those reasons that while I am very much a white woman and recognize that, Black poetry did something for me that I loved poetry young, but I loved Shakespeare's sonnets and the romantic language. And I loved Edgar Allan Poe because I was just a creepy little child. And then I heard Langston Hughes, and I heard Patricia Smith, and I heard Yusef Komunyakaa, and I heard Tyamba Jess, and I went, oh, poetry can do that. Poetry doesn't have to be beautiful. It doesn't have to rhyme, and it can be gritty, and it can be raw, and it can be emotional. And so while, again, my experience is not going to be the same as Patricia Smith, it will always be one of my my dearest ambitions in life to write something that stops someone in their tracks, like Skinhead, that can stop someone and make them go, oh, poetry can do that. And that's something that I think both of you do really well, is that you make poetry accessible. You make poetry enjoyable, and you speak to people that are not stuffy white people in an academic setting, but you can speak to our Black students. You can speak to people who maybe aren't all that familiar with poetry. And I think we're in a time right now where we can see, fingers crossed, a resurgence of poetry becoming a part of our mainstream again. We had an inaugural poet, and she was incredible. And her book sold millions of copies the moment she finished reading, because in that moment, the world saw this young, bright, beautiful Black woman stand up there and unite the country with this message of hope and that we're not going to be let down. And it was another one of those moments where I went, oh, poetry can do that. And it was so wonderful. And so I'm hoping, and I'd love to hear your thoughts of listening to Amanda Gorman speak, having an inaugural poet, having a poet at the Super Bowl. Like, I talk about some worlds colliding that I never expected. And this kind of resurgence of poetry in the mainstream, but not just poetry, of Black poetry in the mainstream. And how does that make you feel? What are your thoughts on this? Because I could go on and on about it, but I don't want to.
Well, I did an interview with a TV station here in Indianapolis, I guess on the Saturday before the Super Bowl. And the fact that they came and tracked me down to talk about poetry, even though they never tried to track me down when I was poet laureate. They never tried to track me down they didn't even try to track me down during National Poetry Month. But this was so substantial and so unexpected for them that they felt like they needed to talk to somebody. And then it turned into being a great discussion about poetry and what poetry does and what it's for. Because, like you said, she just killed it at the inauguration. She killed it at the Super Bowl. And then within a week, I started seeing this commercial for the University of Phoenix using this performance poet, like very clearly. And he's talking about all of the possibilities of education, which I agree with, but then also it's for-profit education, which is a different problem entirely, right? So the fact that just minutes later, some advertiser was like, oh, we could use poetry for this too. So poetry can do that, like you're talking about. It can do that. It can move an entire nation. And at the same time, it can sell Pringles, and it can, hype for-profit institutions and all of this other stuff too, which is wild to me, because poetry is not supposed to be a vehicle for commerce. And yet, as soon as somebody thought it was interesting, they flipped it. So she crushed it. And I'm interested to see kind of what comes out of that for the people who bought her book, and what comes out of that for the sponsors who are looking at her and thinking maybe we can tap into some of her significant energy to do, to sell whatever it is they want to sell. I think she should go get those checks. She needs to secure the bag. You know what I mean? Do what you've got to do while you can to support your art.
Not many poets get the opportunity to become a millionaire, right? We don't do it for the money. So yeah, get those checks.
Yeah, I love what you said, Adrian. But I wanted to add to that by saying, art and commerce, that's a real thing, right? I mean, she comes from the slam world, and that whole scene is about truth telling, but it's also about competition and prizes, right? And so I think it's important, to kind of put things in perspective, because I'm always interested in, well, who's not getting the shine? Like that poet who, I mean, I've gone to so many community events where you'll see young people talking about suicide, or, that family member who comes into their room in the middle of the night, stuff that we would not want to hear probably on inaugural day. But I feel like that may be probably closer to the kind of poetry that I'm interested in, than celebrity poetry. Yeah, like I'm interested in the kind of poetry that makes us a little uncomfortable in our seats, and we have to say, oh my gosh, maybe I need to see someone. I didn't realize that this was a thing for me, but I'm a little weird. But I'm so excited for Amanda. She is gorgeous. I hope she becomes president one day. She definitely has the pedigree to become president as a Harvard alumna. And she got Oprah in her back pocket. So, I mean, you can't go anywhere but up, from there. But I think that it'll be interesting to see if she can use her platform, to kind of bring more of the community and poetry, into the mix, because there's so many young people who, poetry saves their lives, and it saves their lives because they're able to tell their truth. And someone in the audience hearing that, may say, listen, it sounds like, you may need someone to talk to, my wife's a therapist, here's her number, or it sounds like you need a place to live. I'm interested in how art can change things, behind the scenes, not just, in front of the screen. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love that. It makes so much sense to me too, because when you think about the lineage of inaugural poets too, right? There've only been 5, and they were all Democratic presidents who had them. There hasn't been a Republican president who had an inaugural poet, and so there was, Robert Frost for JFK, and he was wonderful, and also a writer of privilege, right? There's somebody in the middle who I can't remember, and then there's Elizabeth Alexander.
Maya Angelou.
Oh, that's who it was. Yeah, was it for
Clinton?
Was it with Clinton? That's why, because I was trying to remember if Jimmy Carter had somebody, and it was always, that's great. So Maya Angelou, who was the opposite of that, right? Someone who was self-made and brilliant and absolutely community centered, right? And then Elizabeth Alexander, who's also fabulous and now runs the Mellon Foundation, right? So she's got a very different perspective. And Richard Blanco, who was an architect, wasn't an academic. He was a poet. And also, he is a poet, I should say, and also does this other day job of being an architect. So you have this, like, there are people who they're essentially all professionals, right, in one way or another, except for Maya Angelou. And so to have Amanda Gorman, who it can't be a professional yet because she just graduated, right, is going to bring a different point of view and hopefully a different kind of energy to that nexus. But she's also coming from Harvard, so the things that her agendas might be different. Who knows? But I'm excited, like you, Abdul, to see what she does. Hopefully, she brings some folks up. Yeah.
That leads me very beautifully, actually, to another question that I personally am interested in hearing what you both have to say. Is we've had, I don't want to say in recent history, because it seems like it's just long history of racial unrest, of violence against people of color, of just senseless killings of people of color. And we're seeing finally the world at large being outraged with George Floyd last summer. And we're starting to hear it be louder. And so one thing that I know that poetry can do and do so well is people can write through that tough stuff that they're dealing with, whether it's personally or whether you're watching it happen on a national stage and being absolutely impacted but don't know what to do. And so we are in a time of social change in a lot of ways, and I feel that poetry can be a vehicle for that. And so I'm interested to know if you consider your poetry a vehicle for social change, for activism, or how you're using your voice to lend itself to that hopeful change that's happening as a society? Or am I being too hopeful maybe in that I'm seeing this change? After a year of isolation and coronavirus, I'm just trying to be hopeful. It's been a rough year for a lot of us, and I'm hoping that seeing a Black poet on Inauguration Day and at the Super Bowl, it nicely counterbalances the unrest we're seeing, and I'm hopeful that poetry can be that. So I'd love to hear what you have to say about poetry as a vehicle or a tool for social change.
Well, I'll say that I rarely set out to write a protest poem. I'll never forget when I was in graduate school, I think the Troy Davis situation was unraveling. And one of my friends in the program, also a white woman, said, Abdul, you should write a poem about this. And I said, no, you should write a poem about this, because I mean, I don't know, I think it might have a different weight, for a white person to write about this topic, because I don't know, I feel like when Black folks write about injustice, I mean, we've been doing this for so long, I don't know how it hits on the ear for people who aren't Black, but I know that it definitely hits different when a white person is writing about those things. And also, as someone who pays very close attention to how art is received and written about and criticism is written, I don't like being put in a box, So it's kind of like, if I choose to write a poem and it's considered a protest poem, that's maybe an unintended effect of it, Like my interest is, how do I write the best poem I know how to write? How do I make full employment of the literary devices to do what I want the poem to do? But I don't want someone to just say, oh, we need, which unfortunately happens, like I remember at work, someone said, Abdul, would you like to read a poem in honor of Black Lives Matter? And I said, no, but I'd be happy to share, some pretty good poets, and you can read one of their poems, but I don't feel comfortable being seen that way as like a spokesperson for an entire community. Like that's not what I'm here to do. And, so that's my little bit. Adrian, I don't know how old you are. Maybe you've gotten some of that in the past, but I'll be interested to see how you handle that.
No, I was just laughing because it's when you find yourself as the only person in the room during Black History Month. When I was in high school, the history teacher called on me and said, what do you think about Martin Luther King? What do you mean? What kind of question is that to ask anybody, but certainly not a 15-year-old kid? I was like, I don't know. I think he did good things. What am I supposed to say about that, right? And so, I think that there's something to be said about poetry and the poetry of surprise. And what I mean is that the best poems come from surprises, right? We're writing and all of a sudden we discover something we didn't know already. So in that space, it makes sense that, asking a Black person who already knows that this is going on, that Black men and women are murdered by police all the time. There's no surprise. There's no surprise there at all for the writer. There's no surprise at all for the people who were enmeshed in that community. The surprise is coming from the people who thought that we were just being dramatic or something like that. And this summer, in the middle of the pandemic, nobody could turn away. They couldn't pretend like it wasn't happening. They couldn't pretend like it was somehow his fault. And, there were the kind of gymnastics that a particular kind of tacit racist uses to excuse violence against Black and brown people didn't work this summer because it was so very clearly not the case. They do these, they've done these studies, I mean, for years, where they'll show someone, photographs of somebody being arrested or something. And some of these photographs are from instances that very clearly ended up being police brutality. And almost always the response is, well, they must have done something to be there. They must have done something for that cop to hit them. They must have done something to be in the back of that squad car. And the fact of the matter is they didn't do anything but be Black a lot of the times. They didn't do anything but get mixed up with the wrong police officer at the wrong time. And so I don't write about this stuff because it's not surprising to me. And when I try to, the poems are soapboxy and didactic and not very interesting poems because there's nothing for me to learn inside of it. I'm not figuring anything else about myself or the world that I didn't know already. But the summer was beautiful in that way. It was so horrible in almost every aspect. But the fact that we were protesting in Indianapolis for like every day for 3 weeks straight, every day, shutting down the middle of downtown to the point where they had to, they had a curfew in the city, and they would block all the streets coming into the city. So if you weren't outside of this perimeter by the time they put it up, you couldn't drive out of it. You'd have to walk out, from wherever you were, because they were not letting anybody come in to protest. And that's how they sort of settled these protests down this summer. But it was beautiful. For the first time, I've lived in Indiana for most of my 30 years, on and off. I've been here. And for the first time ever, it wasn't just all Black and brown people at the circle protesting. It was not just people of a certain age. It went all the way. There were little kids all the way up to elderly people. Everybody was represented in this way beautifully. And it gave me a little bit of hope. I was like, all right, I see this. I see that something's happened since Black Lives Matter, right? Something's happened since 2014 when those protests were happening, and it was almost exclusively Black people. It looks totally different now in the best way. And so if I was ever going to thank 45 for anything, I would thank him for being so awful that he made some people look up and recognize their own complicity in this.
Thank you both for very, very honest answers to a question that could, it's hard as anyone to hear that, no, this happens all the time. We know, unfortunately. But I think that's an important message for the people sitting in this call to hear, because unfortunately, most of the people, we don't have a large presence of our Black students on this call. Most of the people on this call that I can see are Caucasian. And so it's important for us to hear too that, yes, our voices are important and matter. And while it is important for us to lift up the Black and brown voices around us, it's also important for us to make our voices heard, because you're right, that's where the surprise comes from. The surprise is not when we see a Black Lives Matter sign in a person of color's yard. The surprise is when we see a Black Lives Matter sign in a white person's yard. And so I think that's a great thing for us to hear, for sure. It's a great thing for me to hear. So we have about 10-ish minutes left. I want to open it up. I want other people, do you have questions? Do you have comments? Does anyone have anything they want to ask our esteemed poets?
Can I ask a quick question while folks are thinking about their questions?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I wanted to ask you, Adrian, I know that writing the persona poem takes a certain kind of creativity. And I remember when Casey was mentioning how, I'm writing about family history and you're writing about history writ at large. But I don't know, I also wanted to contend that when you're taking on a persona project, you almost have to become Jack Johnson on the page. And I wanted to know what that experience was like. And also, it's a two-part question. I'm thinking of Ishmael Reed, who says, writing is fighting. So you know how Jack Johnson is a boxer, and then you are sort of subsuming the identity of this boxer. And I'm wondering, are you doing some of that work as a civil rights agent yourself by, becoming Jack Johnson?
Those are beautiful questions. Thank you for asking that. Yeah, it was wild because I worked on those poems for so long. And we mentioned Patricia Smith earlier, and I researched for about 2 years without writing anything down. Like I just researched and I researched. I wanted to understand as intimately as I could the circumstances that Jack Johnson traveled in, the spaces, the people, so that I could just think about writing and not think about fact checking and think about the accuracy of it, right? And so in some ways I sort of, I immersed myself in that space and time, and then kind of stepped out of it thinking about what poems look like using that language. And so for a while it didn't work because I was trying to get Jack Johnson to say things that I wanted him to say. Like I wanted him to be sorry for beating his wife, for example. I wanted him to acknowledge the fact that some of the things that happened to him later were the result of his own hubris, right? The same way so many of his successes were connected to that hubris. At some point, the world changed and he stayed the same, and that was on him. So I want him to say these things, and every time I'd write something where he said something that for me was genuine but disingenuous for his history and biography, the poem would absolutely fall apart. And so at some point I had to stop, like I had to move my own ego out of the way and out of the project. And the further removed I got from it and the more foregrounded he got, the better the poems got. So there's a whole stack of poems that failed because I was trying to treat this project like I was the puppeteer, right? When in fact, I'm actually the puppet. And it took me a long time to understand that. And once I did, I think that that's when that switch happened. It was great. I'm really just doing the work he wants me to do now. Like this is a whole other thing. And some of it was really exhilarating. I mean, I'm not a trash talker. You know, I played basketball until I was in my early 40s. And I maybe 5 times my whole life talked trash to somebody. It was not how my game works. Like I'm busy hitting this 3 on you. I don't need to tell you what I'm doing. Like that's not, so to be sort of centering myself with somebody whose whole thing was talking trash and whole thing was talking about how brilliant he was and all of this kind of stuff. It was like fun to do because I would never do that. You know, so for like in some ways, my favorite poems early were the ones where he was just talking. They used to call it mouth fighting. You know, he's like talking trash about these boxers and their weak lefts, and like that was so much fun to me because I would never do that. So I guess that's the trade-off. When I finally got out of the way, then I got sort of rewarded with this imaginary version of the world in which all of that is permissible. You know, yeah. But see, I also would argue that writing about family is writing history. Writing about our neighborhoods is writing history. Like we're cataloging this space the way Gwendolyn Brooks did with the South Side, right? We're cataloging these things. So when you're writing these beautiful poems, that you're cataloging this world that if you don't do it, other people won't ever, or most likely won't see it or experience the way that you wanted to. I mean, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about writing about when you're writing about somebody that exists in the world or down the block you might see at the barbecue next summer or something? Like, how do you feel about what are the complications of writing like that?
Well, it's funny because the older I get, the more I see myself as an archivist. Like I see value in paying homage to these objects and to the films and the television shows and the places. Like it's all very interesting to me. My uncle is a photographer, and I have a poem in the book about him. And he was just so fascinating to me about how he was one of the early photographers that documented hip hop culture. And you know, and I didn't know, I just thought that photography was strictly about taking portraits. I didn't know that it was, you know, photojournalism or cultural commentary, and you could do all these different things. And so I always saw myself as what he did with the camera, I was trying to do with words. And so definitely emphasis on the visual, because I think if the audience can see what you're describing, I think that we're on the same page. We're, you know, having that conversation. But, you know, I never worry about who I'm writing about. I mean, in my opening poem in the book, I don't throw my mom under the bus because my therapist says she should have behaved better, you know? So, you know, so once I got past that, I felt free to write about whatever and whomever I please, you know? Yeah. So I probably won't get invited to the barbecue. I'll be the person to not get invited to the barbecue. Yeah. All
Did
right.
anyone else think of any questions or anything you'd like to ask our poets? Haley, yeah.
I was wondering, by the way, it's been a pleasure listening to both of you read some of your poetry today and talk a little bit about yourself as a poet. So thank you so much for blessing us with your time and your work today. I was wondering if you could talk about any goals that you have as a poet in thinking about the future and thinking about your evolution as a poet, maybe something that you haven't done or haven't worked on yet, but that for whatever reason you feel like you're being led to do. Another way, another question that I had, so feel free to address either one or both of these. They're somewhat related. Is I was wondering if, in addition to talking a little bit about your future goals as a poet, if you might be able to share with us any information about any up and coming writing projects that you are already working on or plan to work on.
Okay. Thank you, Haley, for your very kind words. It's been a pleasure to be with you all, and Adrian. So a project that I would love to do, like I look at poetry very much as similar to photography. Like you have these frozen moments. I would like to know what it's like to animate those moments and to get into filmmaking. So that's something that I hope to be able to do. And because I have to kind of learn that craft of screenwriting, you know, because I've spent all these years working, you know, in poetry and some other stuff. So that's it. I do not have a film coming, but I need to start working on that slowly. And yeah, I'm just writing. I don't have a project that's even I'm not even able to talk about because it's not there yet, but I'm writing. You know, I'm grateful for this sheltering in place because I have a online, you know, poetry group that I get to meet with weekly, and they keep me, you know, honest and writing regularly. But one of my favorite things to do is really to be in community with all different kinds of folks and sharing my work and learning about other people's lives and their stories, because that to me is the real cherry on top, you know, when you can share your work regardless of what your identities are, and then someone in the audience gets up and say, hey, you know, I may not be Black, but I knew exactly what you were talking about, you know, and that is the reward for me, you know, that we can have this this meeting in the middle, you know, we get to have a human moment, you know, because of poetry. So that's the gift that keeps on giving. So thank you, Casey, for giving that to me today with you all.
I just want to say quickly before Adrian answers, I love that you said filmmaking, Abdul, because I have thought multiple times when reading Trouble Sleeping that it reads like a film. I always am in that presence of, and not just like a DVD I pop in, but like old, real film with the old style that you can pull off and that you need a projector for. So that's like you said that, and I was like, yes, do that. Trouble Sleeping on film. Go.
That was the intent, actually. The intent was to write the book to give the reader the experience of sitting in a movie house. So thank you for saying that. I did something right. Thank you.
I think that's really modest. I think you did a whole lot of work. Well, it's really, I'm so pleased to know your work, man, really. Well, I think Casey mentioned this stuff in the introduction that, I don't know, it was like 2017 or 18, after my last book of poetry came out. I felt like I'd done everything that I came to do as a poet. And I was doing the poet laureate stuff. So I was able to do the community work I wanted to do. I'd written the stories that I wanted to write in that moment. And so I thought that it'd be a good time to try some things I didn't know how to do so I could fail significantly. I mean, I'm one of those writers who learns a lot from the things that don't work. And so I started writing song lyrics with a friend of mine who's his name's Nicholas. His band's called Indian Agent. They're on Sub Pop. And so I started writing song lyrics for his band, and that was something that I'd never tried to do before. It was a lot of fun. Then I did a sculpture kind of collaboration with this artist named Dario Robleto in Houston about the visual recorded history of the human heartbeat, like that thing that everybody knows about. And once it's flatlined, it means your heart doesn't. Like, so we did research on that thing and where it came from. It was discovered in the Civil War battlefield and all this kind of stuff. So we made a poetry sculpture visual project from that. And I learned a lot about visual narrative from that. Writing this graphic novel, same thing. I didn't know how to, I'm a huge comic book fan, but I just, so like most knuckleheads, I thought because I read them, I know how to write them. And I had no idea how to write this thing. So I got with this agent, wrote a script, and was like, yeah, this will be like a year-long project. 5 years later, it's finally about to come out. So I started trying to figure out ways to put myself in a position where I was disadvantaged so I could learn things. Like I wanted to learn to be a better writer by figuring out my other weaknesses, and there are so many of them that the project became a little bit bigger than I realized. So I think Nicholas's album is coming out next year. It's got, or no, actually this year, it's coming out this spring. So some of the songs that I wrote are on there, the lyrics anyway. The graphic will be out next year. And then a new book of poems, which was sort of the result of everything that I learned in those failures. And also, as Abdul said, shelter in place, where I was just stuck here. So, well, if I'm going to be stuck here, I better write. And so the new book is all about that too. And I think it reflects what I've learned. I hope it's a testament to the things that people shared with me and taught me over the last 3 or 4 years.
Thank you. Those were great answers. And you're both so inspirational. You're inspiring me to read. You're inspiring me to write. You're making me miss writing daily. And hopefully I leave this with that kind of fire lit under me. But I want that fire to be lit under everyone, because I truly believe poetry is for everyone. And when I say things like that, people usually roll their eyes at me. So I want to plug first, obviously, we all love the Fred L. Matthews Library on SMC's campus. We have copies of Adrian and Abdul's work there. Please come check them out, read them. They're both masterful poets, and we have The Big Smoke and we have Map to the Stars. And so they're two very different collections. And then we have Trouble Sleeping as well. And they're a great read. Beyond that, we have a good collection of poetry. And we also, and Jen will love me for saying it, we can get books through Interlibrary Loan. So I would love, in closing, for both Abdul and Adrian to share either poets past, present, future, who you've read, who you're reading, that you wish more people would read, that you think would open up the world of poetry to people, that maybe it's not a world they often inhabit, or maybe it is a world we inhabit, but might spark that joy and that fire in us again.
I'm typing these in the chat. So if you want to say something, Abdul, I'll come back after that.
Oh, sure. I am a huge fan of Taylor Johnson's Inheritance. I mean, I can't say enough good things about it. I'm going to bring her to my campus. That's how my socks were knocked off, figuratively and literally. Taylor is a trans poet from Washington, D.C., and I had the privilege of watching them grow, as a poet and citizen and artist during their teenage years, and then now to see them develop as this force, it's just it does my heart so much good. So I highly recommend the collection to share with your students, to have a read out loud, to teach the book, and invite Taylor to come to your campus.
Yeah, that's really good. I just put that on my list because I keep hearing great things about the book. I dropped a few in the chat. Patricia Smith, which I misspelled her first name. Sorry, Miss P. Any of her books are brilliant, but Incendiary Art is her most recent, and it's incredible. It was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Lucille Clifton, everything Lucille Clifton. Blessing the Boats is just a good place to start because it's a selected. And then Terrence Hayes' last book, American Sonnets from a Past and Future Assassin, which won the Bobbitt Prize for the best book of poetry in the last couple of years from the Library of Congress, and also won the Hurston Wright Legacy Award for the most significant Black poetry book last year. It's incredible stuff. And any of these poets, they're great anytime, but especially right now in February when we're trying to honor Black writers and show additional love to their work. So I unfortunately have to dip because I'm the director of our program and we had a meeting that started at 4. So they're just all sitting there on this other call waiting for me to show up. But KC, thank you so much. Abdul, thank you for your words and your wisdom. And thanks everybody for listening. I appreciate it. I wish I could stay for a little bit longer, but
Thank you so much, Adrian.
Thank you so much, Adrian.
Yeah, I'll see you all soon. Take care.
Bye.
I thought it was interesting that both Adrian and Abdul tied history to poetry. And it's not that we are this smart as the diversity committee who plan these events, but it's very serendipitous that one of our other events coming up is a book chat about Ibram X. Kendi and Jason Reynolds' Stamped Racism, Anti-Racism, and You. And there's actually a whole chapter on Jack Johnson. So that's an amazing connection. And that's
totally
coming up on, what was that?
We totally did that on purpose.
Oh yeah. I'm just, just false modesty. So we have copies of Stamped in the library available for checkout. It is only 4 hours on audiobook, so it is a quick read. So don't feel like it is too late now to read it before our chat, which is exactly 1 week from today, again at 3 o'clock. So we're trying to take everybody's Wednesdays at 3 o'clock apparently. If anyone has not filled out the survey, I'm going to put the link in the chat one more time just so that so you don't have to scroll back. Especially if you are a student, an SMC student, please fill that out because I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to win one of our poets' books.
Abdul, I don't know what to say. You're just such a treasure and a pleasure. Thank you so much for being here, for dedicating your time to this. And I really appreciate you coming and supporting us and supporting our school.
Great. What a wonderful team you have. It's great to meet you all. And I, keep doing the good work. I know that we all love our students. And, give me a shout if there's anything I can do to help. All right.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for attending. We had a great turnout. I'm very excited. And I look forward to seeing you all hopefully next week as we talk about Stamped that I'm going to go buy on Audible right now because I'm woefully behind. All right. Thanks everybody.